All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. And it's a really, really great pleasure to welcome Sara Constantino back. Yeah, she was one of us for 4 years, I'll tell in a second, but right now she's actually assistant professor at the new Stanford Durr School of Sustainability, and she's in the Department of the Environmental Social Sciences. Just moved there a few months ago in the summer, and before that she was at Northeastern for 2 years as and also an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, the Department of Psychology, and the Marine and Environmental Sciences. And then prior to that, she actually spent 4 years here at Princeton, initially the initial year as a postdoc and then as an associate research fellow, both with me in the Behavioral Science for Policy Lab and also SPEAR more broadly. Her PhD in 2016 is from NYU in the Cognitive and Decision Sciences. She also got a master's degree in economics from UCL, and her bachelor's was in psychology and economics from McGill in 2006. She does a lot of research. The work she did with me mostly was on social norms, but she also publishes on guaranteed income, pluralistic ignorance, collective action, and relocation, displacement, and managed retreat. And you're going to see a little bit mixture of this in her talk today. I also should say she's been hugely productive. Yeah. I think since coming to Princeton, sort of your publication record has exponentially increased. The last CV I could find was in 2022. That's 18 papers in journals like Journal of Neuroscience, a few in PNAS, Nature, Human Behavior, Nature, Sustainability. I also should say she was an editor, one of the inaugural editors for Nature, Sustainability, and Human Behavior, so between 2016 and 2018. But also, yeah, I think articles in climatic change, global environmental change, and I'm sure your number of publications have doubled since 2022. So today she will talk to us about micro-foundations on climate adaptation, governance in small island developing states. Take it away, Sara.
Thank you so much, Elke, for the invitation to come back here, which is very nice, and very nice to see some familiar faces. So when I was initially invited to present, I was going to present work that is more central to my research portfolio, focused more on energy transitions and some recent work I've been doing around the IRA and sociopolitical dimensions of acceptance of IRA-related policies and also uncertainty related to the recent change in administration. But given that this talk is happening just a week after COP ended, and that we just finished analyzing this data, I thought it would be a timely opportunity to present some work that's a little bit more of a departure from what I normally work on, looking at climate adaptation governance in small island developing states. And so I would love your feedback because I'm gonna present data from 2 surveys, and we're about to launch a 3rd survey. And I should also say that this is collaborative work with a group of political scientists. So a lot of the IR theory that I'll talk about is inspired or sort of came from a puzzle that we found in the first survey and comes from one of their research agendas. And so the collaborators are Pasha Madavi, Parrish Bergquist, and Matto Mildenberger. And I should also say that this research is in large part funded by Bob Cohane, and who is also here. Okay. Oh. Can't advance for some reason. Okay. So small island developing states are among the countries most exposed to the impacts of climate change in the world. From the most recent Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index done in association with the World Bank, they estimate that 8 out of the 10 countries that are most exposed to climate change are small island developing states or territories. This is due to both geographic and governance factors. So a large share of the land is low-lying and coastal, and this increases, they also are highly exposed to storms, sea level rise, and coastal erosion. And the cost of adaptation relative to GDP is high, so up to 20% in some of these countries. And as a result of the existential threats they face from climate change, they've also become prominent voices in international climate negotiations, increasing attention to adaptation and advancing the agenda around climate finance and climate aid and compensation for climate vulnerable nations. So small island developing states have a lot of power in these negotiations, and people have theorized that this is both because they've joined forces with other climate vulnerable nations, but also because of the moral salience of their arguments, which call on wealthier countries who've disproportionately benefited from and contributed to climate change to do their share to mitigate its impacts. So the adaptation projects, for example, coastal protection measures, infrastructure resilience, measures to support relocation, that are needed to mitigate the impacts of climate change in these countries, require huge financial investment that these countries often don't have. And at last month's COP in Baku, Mohamed Muzu, the president of the Maldives, emphasized the importance of climate finance from the global north and the critical conditions that small island developing states face today and in the near future. So he said, "It is the lack of finance that inhibits our ambitions, which is why at this COP, the finance COP, we need to deliver. The new climate finance goal must reflect the true scale of the climate crisis. The need is in the trillions, not billions. It must consider the special circumstances of small island developing states." So this is the perspective of elites, and what we wanted to understand in the work I'm going to present is what is the perception of publics in these small island developing states. So the types of adaptation projects that elected officials pursue and the success of these projects hinges on public awareness and acceptance of the proposed solutions, as well as the actors involved in providing these solutions. So despite the climate vulnerable position of many of these countries, they're underrepresented or fully absent from existing cross-national and climate survey efforts. So this is a list of countries that have never been included in a cross-national climate survey or a survey that has any questions about climate change. And this is in part because they're hard to reach by traditional survey methods. It's expensive to survey in these populations. But as a result, there's limited data on how individuals in these countries are experiencing climate change and their preferences regarding adaptation measures and related policies. So here, we try to overcome this limitation by using Facebook to run a large-scale survey of publics in 56 different small island developing states to understand how they're experiencing climate change and adaptation projects, including how they attribute responsibility for the financing of these projects and how they'd like to see them implemented and managed locally. Okay, so I'll walk you through the primary research questions first of our two survey efforts and also mention some of the background literature that motivates these research questions. So, and then I'll show you the results, of course. So first, we ask, how do publics in small island developing states perceive and experience the impacts of climate change, as well as adaptation measures meant to mitigate the impacts of climate change? So while the global literature on climate literacy and climate concern is mixed, with some studies finding low climate literacy across various countries in Africa, for example, a recent study run by a subset of the collaborators on this paper that takes an overview of all the surveys that have questions about climate change in the world that include more than a sample from more than one country, find high concern about climate change on average across the global south. They also find heterogeneity across locations, with oil-producing nations becoming less concerned over time, probably because of political communication. And they find low, persistent, and sort of widespread, low perceived efficacy to address climate change among the publics in these countries. But remember, these countries do not include the small island developing states, which have mostly, for the most part, been left out of these surveys. Second, we ask who residents in small island developing states think should pay for climate adaptation projects. So there are three strands of existing literature that might provide different answers. So some political economists argue that ultimately, colonial powers should be responsible for restitution and reparations for past injustices. And this translates to paying for the challenges facing nations in the global south today, including climate change. In the late 1990s, the principle that emerged in the international climate negotiations was that of common but differentiated responsibilities, which suggests that while all countries have to pitch in to tackle climate change, the highest historical emitters, and to some extent high current emitters as well, like China, should do the most. Separate from emissions, some have also attributed the responsibility for addressing climate change to all wealthy countries on the basis of their ability to pay for the problem, even if they didn't necessarily contribute to it. So you can think of a country like Switzerland. Okay. Third, the source of money isn't the only challenge, as the local success of a project depends on who implements, manages, and oversees it. So we also ask, who do people want to manage or oversee adaptation spending? So conventional wisdom from the foreign aid literature, not in the context of climate change, for example, in the context of poverty alleviation, finds limited trust in projects overseen by foreign actors, due in part to past experience with those actors or the view that they don't know the local context as well as local governments do, and concerns about sovereignty and self-determination, which have also come up in climate governance-related issues among small island developing states. There are some exceptions for some Western governments in contexts with low domestic trust. So there's some literature from Africa showing that sometimes countries will prefer external oversight when they are in a context where they have particularly low trust in their own governments. So here we ask, given the stakes, scale, and causes of climate change, might the preference for external oversight and who manages these projects play out differently? And might people actually prefer external oversight? And one of the reasons I'm posing this leading question here is that this was a puzzle that came up in Survey 1 that sort of motivated this direction of research questions in Survey 2. And so what we find is we asked people to answer the following question: which of the following statements comes closest to your view when, and then we randomized different foreign entities, which I'm ignoring right now, give loans or financial assistance to your country for climate adaptation, they should enforce strict requirements on how the funds are spent, or they should allow our country to make its own decisions about how to use the resources. So what you see here is data across 56 different small island developing states, where the lines in yellow show you the proportion of people who say that they would prefer external oversight of those projects. So this was surprising to us given the literature on foreign aid and also given the substantial, almost majority support across almost all of our countries. Okay, so then we also ask, this is the final question we ask, what might underlie the widespread support for external oversight of climate adaptation spending by local governments? And here we draw on mechanisms from the comparative politics literature about the factors that shape support for public service provision by foreign versus domestic actors. So in particular, home governments might be perceived as corrupt, and this might raise concerns that money from outside will not reach those who are in the most need. In such contexts, individuals might see foreign actors as able to minimize inefficiencies from corruption. On the other hand, home governments might be perceived as well-intentioned, but without the capacity to manage or oversee large-scale projects effectively. And so recent work in the context of climate change shows that people see international institutions like the World Bank as particularly trustworthy, impartial, and effective when it comes to managing climate agreements more generally, not necessarily adaptation projects. And so we ask about that in our surveys. Okay, so to answer these questions, we use Facebook ad-based quota sampling to recruit this large sample of respondents across all these small island developing states. So these are examples of the geo-targeted ads that respondents see on Facebook. They see them specific to the place where they're living, and they can choose to respond to the survey for a small compensation. So far, we've launched 2 cross-sectional surveys. The first focused on experiences of climate change and adaptation measures. The second focused on these other questions of attribution of responsibility and oversight for local projects, and I'll go through some of the results of both. So the first survey was conducted between June and July 2022 and included over 20,000 respondents across 56 small island states and territories. And respondents were incentivized with a potential prize. They'd be drawn out of 500 respondents to win a potential prize, and this prize was increase this monetary prize for harder to reach quotas to ensure that we have a good distribution of the population. We also use survey weights to survey weights based on age, gender, and geography. And we're currently working on including education ones to also try and account for some of the bias in the Facebook sample. The second survey was conducted in March 2024, so just earlier this year, after the Dubai COP, and this one included over 18,000 respondents. We went back to 52 small island states and territories. We left out 4 countries with very small populations to avoid sort of oversaturating the population with surveys and survey fatigue. Okay, so as I mentioned, we apply survey weights based on gender, age, and geography to overcome a couple things. The Facebook sample is biased, and it's biased in multiple ways. The population on Facebook is different from the population in these countries, and Facebook's algorithm is optimized to select the most common respondent type because that reduces the costs of running these surveys. And so what we do is we run the campaign across different quota groups and then use weights additionally to adjust for these kinds of biases. So in a separate paper, I mentioned that some of the team has been working on sort of optimizing these Facebook ad targeting methods for surveys of hard-to-reach populations. So they have a paper that is coming out later this year where they validate this sampling method against the national census data and against what would be the otherwise best way, optimal way to collect data in these countries, which is using these online panels like Dynata. And they do this in 3 countries, so Indonesia, Kenya, and Mexico. And they find that with weighting, they're able to partially adjust for the biases introduced by sampling on Facebook. And they do better than a company like Dynata, who collects a nationally representative survey based on an online panel that they have. Okay, so now turning to the survey results, I'll start with some descriptive findings from the first survey. So overall, we find that residents across the 56 countries and territories that we sampled, shown here again in rows, are very aware of climate change. That's why this all looks green. The respondents in green respond yes to the following question, which is a question taken from the Yale Communications on Climate Change survey. Recently, you may have noticed that climate change has been getting some attention in the news. Climate change is also sometimes called global warming. Climate change refers to the idea that the world's average temperature has been increasing over the past 150 years, maybe increasing more in the future, and that the world's climate change may change as a result. Do you think that climate change is happening? The figure looks very similar for belief in anthropogenic climate change. And this is a map showing a very similar figure, just laid out slightly differently, showing for each country how concerned people are about climate change and also extreme weather. So this one's actually showing you extreme weather. It looks very similar for concern about climate change. So overall, we find that awareness and concern in our survey is stronger than that reported across other countries in the global south on comparable questions. We also included questions from the Yale Communications on Climate Change survey that asks, how much do you think climate change or sea level rise or coastal erosion, these are different questions, will harm different groups? So yourself personally, your community, people in your country, people in developing countries, people in rich nations. So this question has been used to show the psychological distance associated with climate change. That is that people perceive climate change as a greater threat to those further away from them in both space and time. This one's looking at space. They're equivalent ones for time. So what we find are that residents in small island developing states similarly show this pattern, but it's muted relative to the pattern in the US. We also find that concern about climate change, sea level rise here, but it's similar for climate change, is high for residents in small island developing states, irrespective of the fraction of the population living in low-lying elevation or in immediate proximity to the coast, or with past experience, self-reported past experience of climate extreme weather events. Okay. We also asked about experience with and preferences regarding adaptation measures. So here, we asked, we find that experiences with 3 different climate adaptation measures here coastal infrastructure projects, including seawalls or levees, disaster risk management plans, and relief or financial support for climate vulnerable populations is limited and heterogeneous. So you see that it varies a lot across countries. It also varies within countries. And it's much less consistent than the other figures I was showing you. We find that despite this limited experience with adaptation in place or in situ adaptation measures, there's a preference for those over support for relocation. And specifically, there's a preference for nature-based solutions. And so what this figure shows is we gave people this sort of mini experiment where we said coastal communities around the world are currently faced with climate changes that can result in extreme weather events. Some communities are preparing responses to these changes to increase resilience. We're interested in what you think about different kinds of community responses. Rising sea levels have led to coastal erosion, floods, and irreparable damage to coastal communities. In response, then we randomize the actor, whether it's your local government, multinational corporations, or foreign governments, are planning a type of activity. And this might be help to relocate, restoration of wetlands, building of seawalls, et cetera, in your town. And so what we find is that people have a preference for adaptation in place. They also show a preference for these projects to be overseen or managed by multinational corporations and foreign governments relative to their own governments. And so this sort of echoes this finding that I showed earlier of overwhelming support for external oversight of local adaptation spending. I'm showing you again here, because this motivates a lot of the questions that we then included in Survey 2. Okay, so given the preferences we find in Survey 1, we focused Survey 2 on questions of responsibility for climate adaptation, financing, and the management and oversight of adaptation projects in 2 separate experiments. So specifically, we ask, who do mass publics hold most responsible for climate adaptation financing? And who do they want to manage or oversee local climate adaptation projects? And what factors account for the surprising widespread support of foreign oversight of climate adaptation? Okay, so to answer the question first about perceived responsibility for climate finance, and to differentiate between attributions of responsibility based on colonial history, emissions, and per capita income, we use a very short conjoint experiment. So for those not familiar with conjoint experiments, what we do is we create 2 country profiles that vary in whether the country colonized islands in the respondent's region or not, whether they're high, medium, or low polluters, and whether they have high, medium, or low per capita income. So respondents see these 2 profiles here. They're not filled in, but this would have information about these characteristics for country A, these characteristics for country B. We then ask respondents to indicate which country, given the particular combinations of these characteristics, should contribute most to a climate fund. So this setup allows us to understand the causal impact of these different characteristics on attribution of responsibility for climate finance. So what this plot shows here is the results of this experiment. These are the average marginal component effects. These are the average causal effect of each attribute level on the respondent's attribution of responsibility relative to a baseline attribute shown here in gray. So the gray circle is the baseline, and these are the comparisons relative to the baseline. So we find that all 3 characteristics, colonial history, historical emissions, and income, shape the attribution of responsibility. We find that colonial history is a stronger predictor of responsibility than income alone. And we find that high historical emissions and income are very similar. They're not significantly different from each other. This is, of course, a really abstract experiment with no specific country characteristics. And I'll show you the results of one where we directly ask as well. I just wanted to take this brief aside because we set up this experiment to disambiguate among these 3 potential explanations for attribution of responsibility that came out of the literature I mentioned earlier. But they're also overlapping. So just a couple of days ago, I came across this carbon brief report that attempts to calculate cumulative historical emissions accounting for colonization. So specifically what they do is reallocate emissions that happened in controlled territories during colonial rule to the colonizer. And what they find is that this results in some reordering of countries with highest cumulative historical emissions. Specifically, you see that the UK's historical emissions, as well as the Netherlands, increase while India decreases. So these categories, this is just to say that these categories aren't perfectly distinct. Okay. Oh, I don't have the direct question here. Okay, I can show you after. So next, we ask, who do publics in these countries want to manage or oversee local climate adaptation projects? And what factors account for surprising widespread support of foreign oversight of climate adaptation? So we designed an experiment to assess preferences for external oversight of local government spending and to determine whether the target of the aid, that is, whether it is climate related or not, because remember, this is one of our hypotheses for why we might be seeing this large preference for external oversight, and the source of the aid impact these preferences. So we provided respondents with a vignette that reads, there is growing pressure for high-income countries and international organizations to provide financial and technical assistance to low-income countries to help them, and then we vary what the aid is supposed to be targeted for. So it might be to adapt to climate change, to alleviate poverty, and to build non-climate related infrastructure such as roads. There has been a lot of discussion about who should get to determine how this money should be used. Which of the following statements is closest to your view? And then we ask them to choose between these two statements. The first one says, when, and then the source of the financial and technical assistance, we vary between US, China, the specific colonial power, or international organizations. To your country, they should enforce strict requirements about how to use the money, whereas the second question says they should allow our government to make its own decisions about how to use the money. So this is very similar to the oversight results I showed you earlier, but now we can try and understand whether this is specific to climate-related projects and how this relates to the source of the financing. Okay, so first, marginalizing across the different treatment conditions, we again find strong support for external oversight of local government spending, echoing our findings from the first survey, so it wasn't a sort of anomalous survey response. We replicate this and show this is also the case across most of the countries. So now I'll walk you through the effects of the target and source treatment results. Each of the red brackets here indicates a separate regression. So the top one is a single regression. The three source funding source are their own regression. So we're looking at these treatment effects sort of independently of each other. And so these are regressions where the independent variable is indicated on the y-axis, and the dependent variable for all of these regressions is a binary variable indicating whether the respondent selected the statement that expresses a preference for enforcement of strict requirements on how local governments spend financial assistance. So a positive value on this plot indicates that the independent variable increases support for external oversight relative to the base category, while a negative value indicates that the variable instead increases support for local government control. Okay, so first we find that assistance for climate adaptation projects is no different from other types of assistance in terms of preferences for external oversight. So this was our sort of primary hypothesis going into this, and we don't find that that's the case. So here we see no significant difference when people see the climate adaptation project relative to when they see a poverty alleviation focused project or a non-climate infrastructure development project. Second, when looking at the effects of the source of the climate assistance, we find that financial assistance from the US and colonial powers is very similar to that from international organizations. That's the base category that you don't see here. So zero difference means zero difference from the international organization. When it comes to preferences for external oversight. However, we do find that when a project is financed by China, respondents prefer to maintain local government control over spending relative to when it's financed by international organizations. Okay, so this might be due to low levels of trust in China. We hadn't really sort of expected this result, but we did ask this question about trust in different governments. While respondents report low levels of trust in their own government on a 4-point Likert scale that goes from very little trust, high distrust to high trust, they have even lower trust in China when asked in the survey, at least on average. Respondents might have interpreted our question to mean that oversight would come from the country providing the financial assistance. And when it comes from a country they don't trust, they might prefer their government to maintain control. This is one working hypothesis that could explain some of these results. So the trust rankings, and specifically the low levels of trust in home country government, are also suggestive of why we might be finding these preferences for oversight of local government projects. So moving beyond trust as a construct, and to be a little bit more specific, and also to speak to some of the literature I mentioned earlier, we now ask whether views of corruption and patronage, or the capacity of actors to effectively implement the project, shape support for oversight. So to do this, we collected perceptions of corruption, patronage, and capacity or efficacy of different actors in implementing these projects before the experiment, using again a series of binary statements. So we based these questions on a prior paper, actually that Helen Milner here was involved with, assessing perceptions of foreign aid outside of the climate context. The foreign actor in the statement that respondents saw matches the actor they then saw in the experiment. So they're specifically responding with respect to that actor. So overall, we find high perceptions of home government corruption. That's the top row. I think it's green is the proportion of people who say that they expect corruption from their local government. And we also find greater perceptions of foreign actor capacity to implement effective local projects relative to the home country government. So these are the middle two rows. And in yellow, what you see, those are the proportion of people who think that foreign actors will be more effective at implementing these projects. With the exception of patronage, our results suggest that foreign actors, including both foreign governments and international organizations, collapsed here, are perceived to be more effective at allocating financial assistance than home country governments. We do, however, the last one is the patronage one. We do, however, find an equal split on whether aid from foreign governments or international organizations is perceived to be allocated to those with the most need or to friends and allies of powerful individuals. Okay. So marginalizing now across the treatment categories and focusing on these bottom three rows, we find that respondents who view their own government as corrupt and foreign-led projects as more effective compared to locally administered projects tend to support oversight of their local governments by foreign actors. Next, we looked at whether these perceptions of local and foreign actors moderate preferences for oversight depending on the type of actor, specifically whether the type of actor is a foreign government, collapsing now across all foreign governments, or an international organization. And the reason we do this is, one, we weren't expecting to see the result that we found for China. When we separate them out, we don't actually see significant differences, so we felt that it was okay to collapse them. But also because this speaks to some of the literature on, specifically in the climate context, that shows broad support for international organizations in managing climate agreements. So that's the reason that we split them out that way. So that's what I'm going to show here. In these three panels, I'm showing the interaction effects, and what we find is that overall, viewing foreign projects as subject to patronage increases support for oversight. This is when you view even foreign-financed projects as susceptible to patronage, you support external oversight of how that money is spent. But this effect doesn't differ depending on the type of actor, whether it's a foreign government or international organization. Now looking at perceived capacity of the actors, We also find that overall, viewing projects funded and built by foreign actors as more effective compared to locally run projects, those are the purple lines relative to the blue lines, significantly increases support for external oversight of adaptation projects. But again, this doesn't vary by whether it's a foreign government or an international organization. Okay, so let me summarize some of our results. We ran the first cross-national climate survey of small island developing states. And we find that knowledge and concern are widespread. There's greater awareness and greater concern than in other cross-national surveys of countries in the global south. We also find that publics have a preference for adaptation in place relative to measures to support relocation. Yet experience with adaptation projects is limited and heterogeneous to date. We also find that attribution of responsibility for climate finance depends on colonial history as much or more than historic emissions or per capita income, suggesting a moral and reparative dimension in this attribution of responsibility. We find that support for external oversight of local adaptation spending is high, much higher than what we would have expected based on the foreign aid literature, that tends to find preferences for local government sovereignty under some conditions. Of course, when there's local distrust in government, the results look different. And so that's similar to what we're finding. We find that this is not specific to climate projects, although the distinction among climate adaptation versus poverty alleviation versus non-climate infrastructure development could be unclear. You might argue that all of these could be considered climate adaptation measures. We also find that this is true, this preference for external oversight is true for most sources of climate aid, with the exception of China. And this is in line with previous work by Helen Milner and others. But we also find that the preference for external oversight isn't specific to foreign governments. It's also there for international organizations. We don't see this sort of privileged role for international organizations that the prior literature has found in the context of climate agreements. And finally, we find that this is possibly explained by perceptions of own government corruption, expectations of patronage, and perceived capacity or effectiveness of foreign-led projects relative to locally led projects. So just to conclude, I'm just going to show 2 more slides. So we also asked at the end of the survey a couple questions that were more specific to decisions from COP28. So we asked about preferences, about who oversees the loss and damage fund specifically, who oversees how funds are spent, and we generally find widespread support for the World Bank as a manager of the fund. We also find that people perceive that this fund will help people like them, so they perceive that they'll benefit from these funds. So now, just thinking about what some of the policy implications are, there's limited reported experience with a variety of climate adaptation measures. And COP29, the COP that just ended, resulted in a small climate finance commitment of $300 billion per year that could increase climate adaptation projects. And at least from these survey results, we find that publics in small island developing states express a strong preference for external oversight of requirements on local adaptation spending, which could inform how this spending is structured, potentially. In future directions, we're running a 3rd survey. This one's focused more on questions of relocation and migration intentions. But if people have thoughts, additional hypotheses, or thoughts on questions we should include, I would love to hear them. And this is also part of ongoing research where we're using Facebook for longitudinal geo-targeted surveys to understand perceptions and experiences of climate change, emerging needs and policy preferences in hard-to-reach or undersurveyed populations, but also it's something that we're planning to use in the US and would allow us to sample around, for example, new energy infrastructure developments and have much more spatially focused questions in our surveys that we can answer looking at local variation. So those are some of the future directions, and I will conclude there. Thank you.
Yep. This is fascinating. I have 2 questions related to trust. So for the counterexample I can give here is that, a lot of African countries don't really trust China, but it doesn't affect the fact that China is still the largest funder in terms of energy projects. So I want to understand a little bit more, like to what extent does like public perception and trust really matter in terms of like adaptation project or like climate financing in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the second one's harder to answer than the first. Let me say something about the first. We actually have measures of, or people's perceptions of who has funded most adaptation projects locally and of past experience with funding for development projects more generally. We haven't looked at that data, but someone suggested that to me earlier today in one of my meetings, and I think that, yeah, we should definitely do that, because I think that prior relationship, and I think it could go either way, that could either improve trust, or actually the literature that I was referencing shows that some of these past experiences have been negative and that actually decreases trust or increases support for oversight. So I'm excited to look at that data. On the second question, I think that's a really tough question, how much the public opinion in these places actually matters in terms of shaping who is funding these projects and what types of projects are being implemented. I mean, a lot of my work is in the US context, where we do see a lot of opposition to local development projects, and I think that public opinion, at least on that local scale, matters a lot, for example, for siting decisions around renewable energy projects. For projects in these small island developing states, I'm not sure, and that's something we're still trying to, I think it's important to understand the preferences of these populations and what the publics at least say that they want. Whether those actually impact the way that things unfold and impact the types of adaptation projects that are being introduced, I'm not sure. And I think that's a really important question.
Saying they prefer, in many instances, rich countries and or multilaterals to administer the projects. How can we square this? Because it's the sovereign governments that are pushing for the adaptation project financing in the first place. So if the ambition of the paper is about the micro-foundations of small island development state policy preferences on adaptation, how do we square this disconnect between the role of the sovereign, the national sovereign government in pushing for the adaptation projects and the expressed preferences in the survey of the respondents?
I think that's a good question. I think that's one we were sort of trying to answer and maybe haven't done so effectively, is why this preference for oversight exists, and like whether this is also, so these surveys haven't been done, and so the preferences of these populations, they might be clear to their elected officials. I'm not sure, but these, in general on the scale, this is new data, and I'm not sure that this is generally known, and it was actually a kind of surprising result that there's this much preference for external oversight. So that's one thing, is I'm not sure that there's like complete public awareness of that. The other thing I wanted to mention in relation to your question is this book, I'm trying to remember the title, by Federica Genovese, on weak nations at climate negotiations, the power of weak nations at climate negotiations, which is in part the way she makes the argument is that it's not so much the public preferences in these countries that matter, it's the public preferences in other countries, it's the public opinions in other countries and support for these kinds of moral issues and perceptions that like what we have done is unfair as a wealthy nation, or these appeals on these issues that aren't necessarily central to the strong states, like around adaptation and climate finance, that have this moral nature. What matters is the public opinions of other, publics in strong states in terms of driving these agendas in the international climate negotiations. So, I mean, that's sort of going against what we're doing here, which is saying that the public opinion in these states matters by arguing, by giving you this counterexample that she poses, which is that the public opinion in these states actually doesn't matter that much. What matters is the elite agenda and how that relates to the public opinion in the strong states, right? But I don't think that fully answers your question. I have to think a little bit more about how to reconcile those two. Yep.
Thanks, Sarah. This is really interesting. I was wondering within country if you've seen any variation among subpopulation within your samples, so like by demographics or politicized issues or worldviews or anything like that.
Yeah, there is a lot of subnational variation, probably more subnational variation than cross-national variation on some of these questions, like when we look across countries. And the variation we've looked at is in terms of demographic factors. We actually see greater male concern about climate change. I think this is in part because of higher education. I think it might have something to do with that. We also see, what we don't see is based on self-reported previous experience with extreme weather or perceptions that climate change is impacting you, impacts the kinds of policies you prefer, also impacts whether you report having experienced adaptation measures. If we try and do this more objectively by looking at whether people are in low-lying regions, with the kinds of vulnerabilities they might face in a more objective sense, we don't find heterogeneity there. That doesn't seem to actually predict climate concerns. So it probably is more these like personal views and worldviews and prior concern, as well as demographics that explain the subnational variation. But it's something we haven't dug into enough yet.
And then just, that was helpful. So like the regressions, most of the regressions you're showing us, is that aggregated across all the countries?
It's aggregated across all the countries with country-level fixed effects and clustered standard errors per country. So it accounts for some of the variation across countries, but we're not trying to explain this variation based on different country characteristics. And we're also not including demographics right now beyond like weighting the data. Yeah. Yep. Interesting. That.
First, could you look at whether or not these results vary by the legitimacy of democracies in various countries that care and measured by these indexes out there of democratic function? So do you see populations, for example, being dominated as their governments in countries that are supposed to have better democracy? And the second is just a little bit more methodological. Obviously very hard to do, but it'd be fascinating to interview a sample of these folks with the response to try and understand, where, sort of from a qualitative point of view, what they say about why they respond the way they do, and what is their understanding of how these projects have been implemented in the past, what the causes of distrust with China, their own governments, and so on. Obviously, that's very challenging, but that would be fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful suggestion for next steps, because I think there's still a lot of puzzles that we haven't answered, like the one, Ben, that you raised, and also your first point, I think, is related as well. What we do have is open text responses that we haven't analyzed yet, just asking people to reflect on why they have a preference for external oversight, what they think this might improve. So we have text data that we haven't analyzed yet, and that's something we can do. But of course, we'd learn a lot more from interviews, especially about surprising results like the China result, which we weren't expecting. On your previous question, that's something on our list to do, like looking at the VDEM, variance of democracy, other kinds of scales to try and understand whether those predict cross-country variation in preferences for external oversight. which I think would help answer these questions as well, but we haven't done that yet, but that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. I also kind of have a twofold question. So one is, do you have a sense of how representative these survey responses are of like the more general population? Because I imagine where the person in your country would have any difference. And then two, in your like follow-up surveys, have you given any thought to maybe like supplementing this methodology with like another kind of survey?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's one that we have not validated these specific samples. But the work that Maddo, who's a co-author on this, and others have done, have tried to validate these Facebook samples across different regions in the Global South with specific countries. So they've looked at Kenya, Mexico, and Indonesia. This is what I was mentioning earlier, to try and optimize the Facebook sampling and weights in order to match the census data on census data demographics. By weighting the data, they do a lot better than they otherwise do, but there's bias introduced because the Facebook population is different from the average population. It skews more educated, it skews younger. The Facebook population the Facebook sample is then an even more biased population because those are people who don't attrit out of the survey, they're people who opt in to do this kind of thing. And so using these quotas helps to bridge some of those biases and to make the data look a little bit closer to the census data. This is other work that they've done to try and validate these samples. And what they find is that there might be other systematic biases or maybe benefits from using Facebook samples. And one is that people appear to be more, or report doing more political activities. And they also report, though, lower voting. This is Indonesia data. So you see differences in data from Indonesia. You see differences in terms of political participation, which is what they were able to use here to validate against these other surveys like Dynata or the Asia Barometer. And they also look at actual election results, so data in terms of the percentage that actually voted, and they find that the Facebook sample is closest to that than other sampling methods, so closer to the objective voting data. And one of their conclusions in this paper is that these Facebook samples introduce biases because of the sample characteristics, but they might also reduce social desirability biases that are introduced in door-to-door samples. And so the Asia Barometer, part of the sample is door-to-door, and people might feel pressure to say that they didn't engage in political activity, depending on the context. And so you might see that these online surveys are a little bit more anonymous and might overcome social desirability bias, but I think the way that these biases enter is going to be nuanced and depend on the questions. So, yeah.
I have some other methodological questions. First of all, this is really fascinating. This was done online, like I'm assuming. And how long did the survey take for participants?
It looks long because of all these vignettes, but there was like nothing else in the survey. So it's actually a quite short survey. I think it was 5 to 7 minutes or 5 to 8 minutes. We also, because it was such a big sample, randomized, because there are a bunch of experiments and things, we randomized who saw what to make sure that it wasn't overtaxing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you said there were 56 countries, so how many participants per country in general?
There are 20,000 participants overall. There's a minimum of 150 participants per country and a maximum of 750 participants per country. Oh no, there have to be more. I can't, but there's a floor of 150.
And
Yeah.
So for the follow-up survey, did you make sure to not interview or resurvey the same population? And if so, I think that could be something really interesting to follow up with some of the original participants. Some of these countries I'm sure are going to experience climate crises in between survey waves, and you might be able to get some really interesting information about that. I just want to put a plug in for LabPop. They have done some surveys of the Caribbean countries. I'm not sure how many specific climate questions have been asked, but I would take another look at it because I think that there's at least some of those Caribbean countries and Latin American countries that might have some questions related to climate there.
Yeah. That's true, and LabHub actually has more climate questions than the other barometers and is more useful for at least like climate-related questions than these other ones. So actually we could use that maybe for validation. So that's a good idea. In terms of, I'm trying to remember the question you just asked. Oh, it's not the same sample. These are people who hadn't taken the first survey. So we don't have longitudinal data in terms of experience of extreme weather events, for example, or a new adaptation-related project. It is something we've talked about doing subsequently to use really short surveys and like 2-minute surveys to be able to sort of take the pulse as events unfold or as people experience new infrastructure projects or things like that, to try and understand how perceptions and how support for different policies or support for different measures change over time as these measures are introduced. But we don't have that here. Yeah.
Did you ask any questions about their preferences with respect to mitigation as opposed to just adaptation?
We did, and we have not analyzed those yet. Yeah, but I'm excited to look at those. Yeah.
Co-benefits strikes me as a way of getting at some of the questions what people know and how they're thinking about projects. Can you explore what they think to be the benefits and therefore strictly activity, and or they see other climate unrelated benefits that come along?
That's a great question. We asked very broadly about different projects. I mean, the projects tended to be very climate adaptation focused projects, but we then ask, do you think this will benefit you and your community? Do you think this will have economic benefits? Do you think this will have health benefits? So we do have those questions. We haven't looked at them. I'm just showing the how much you support this project question for a lot of these analyses, but that's something we could look at as well.
There might be particular co-benefits correspond to the high approval of the project.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good idea. We haven't looked at that yet. Yeah, but it could be that perceived health benefits, for example, increase support much more than economic benefits, or yeah, or other way around. Yeah. Yep. Oh, no, it was translated into, I think I can't remember right now, but maybe the top 3 local most prevalent languages. So it's kind of a mess then in the data because everything's translated, but we translated into Portuguese, to Spanish, French, Dutch. There's just a lot of different languages, yeah. Thank you so much.